Hello and welcome to my presentation regarding the French National Guard during the Paris Commune of 1871. Throughout this presentation, I will be examining the question of how revolutionary were the National Guard, defining revolutionary as causing major changes to the systems that they were a part of. The history of the National Guard begins in 1789, at the dawn of the French Revolution. They were formed as a counterbalance to the regular army, and they were headed by the Marquis de Lafayette. They were instrumental in bringing the downfall of the Ancien Regime, in that they were made up of some of the most radical city dwellers in France. Radical and armed civilians inside the National Guard became the military arm of the urban mobs who dictated the early stages of the revolution. The National Guard continued to be a part of France through the tumultuous early 19th century, always siding with the more radical side of the revolutions, including the July Revolution of 1830 and the revolutions of 1848. When Napoleon III came to power in 1849, the National Guard was stripped of much of its responsibility and relegated to only home defense during his reign. During Napoleon III's reign, massive changes were being undertaken in Paris. Napoleon planned to rebuild Paris into a world capital, with the wide boulevards that we know of today. Napoleon tasked his Minister of the Interior, Haussmann, with this construction project, which saw the gentrification of Paris neighborhoods and the expulsion of poor and working classes to the peripheries of Paris. However, in the west side of Paris, the Haussmann reforms were quite popular with the rich aristocrats, marking a strong class divide inside of Paris. Now to talk about the makeup of the National Guard on the eve of the Paris Commune. These men were largely made up of the lowest classes of Paris, forced to join the Guard as they were the only entity hiring and paying 1.5 francs a day, a high wage for the poor workers. Naturally, as they were motivated more by their paycheck than a sense of patriotism, they developed strong loyalty to each other and their officers, who were elected by their soldiers. They also only wanted to be stationed inside of their own neighborhood, leaving huge parts of the National Guard idle in the east and northeast sides of Paris. In 1870, Napoleon launched the ill-fated Franco-Prussian War, and left the National Guard inside of the urban areas to defend while his armies went to the frontiers. Napoleon lost terribly in this war, resulting in his capture and the capture of nearly the entire army sent to fight the Prussians. With Napoleon captured, the army all but disarmed, and the Prussians on their way to Paris, National Guard recruitment spiked in an attempt to emulate the famous levée en masse from the French Revolution. Their numbers approached 400,000 guardsmen by the end of 1870. While Paris did attempt to hold out against the Prussians, it was a losing battle from the start, and an armistice was soon declared. The Prussians embarrassed the Parisians by marching through Paris and staying on the outskirts for weeks during the peace talks. The National Guard, as well as the urban masses of Paris, wanted to continue the fight, but were left to accept the terms written by the Provisional Government, and no major fighting occurred between the Prussians and the National Guard. This divide between the Provisional Government and the people of Paris only grew after the peace was signed. A republic was declared, but when the vote happened, the moderates, or even monarchists, won handily in everywhere but Paris, where radical socialists won most seats. As a provisional government, now headed by Adolphe Thiers, felt it was the legitimate government of France, it attempted to regain control of Paris from the guardsmen who were now taking control, with their own central committee. This rising tension escalated into violence, and then the declaration of the Paris Commune on March 18, 1871. The Versaillais, the troops loyal to the provisional government under Adolphe Thiers, attempted to go into Paris to take the cannons which the Guard had used to defend Paris from the Prussians, away from the most radical neighborhoods. When the troops entered Paris, they were met with widespread resentment and distrust, and when they began to remove the cannons from their perches, the National Guard, as well as normal civilians, began erecting barricades to block the Versaillais. Many of the Versaillais defected to the National Guard, and no cannons were removed from Paris, marking the beginning of the Paris Commune. The newly formed Commune was dominated by the most radical members of the Central Committee, known as the Blanquists. They were radical socialists, verging on the edge of anarchism. As such, they sided with the urban masses of Paris as they guaranteed bread and wages. The National Guardsmen, after the victory of March 18th, had only one desire: the continuation of their 1.5 franc per day wage. When the Central Committee guaranteed this wage, the poor Parisians joined up, and the National Guard again swelled its ranks. By April of 1871, the National Guard could claim every male over 18 as a guardsman, meaning that Paris was a true example of the levée en masse. The guards, however, not fully motivated by their paycheck as opposed to some abstract patriotism, grew complacent as they felt the revolution was won on March 18th. Several attempts at reform were made, but any discipline in the army was met with the re-election of their commanding officers. Cluseret was charged with implementing reforms to the Guard, but it was far too late. The underlying democratic traditions of the Guard meant that they discussed every order and chose to not obey those they deemed irrational or too dangerous. When the Versaillais began their attempt to retake Paris in earnest, the failures of the National Guard's democratic principles came through. While they still stated they had 400,000 men ready to fight, historians agree that the number who actually defended Paris was 20,000 or less. During the Bloody Week, as it became known, more than 6,000 Communards and National Guardsmen were killed, and Paris was lost to the Versaillais. Executions followed, and the Paris Commune and its National Guard were crushed on May 28, 1871, just 2 months after its declaration. The National Guards were in fact a very revolutionary force. Even as they began to decay into atrophy following March 18th, they were still instrumental in setting up the first proletariat-driven state. They were so revolutionary that in 1872, as the provisional government regained full control, the National Guards were disbanded until 2016, meaning that the government feared the revolutionary potential. The Paris Commune inspired all the Marxist thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with every author having some opinion on why it failed. But the style of revolution conducted by the National Guards were almost identical to how the later Bolshevik Revolution would begin. Further, historians today agree that the Paris Commune was the only serious attempt at an anarchist style of government, which seems rather revolutionary to me. Thank you.